This is a critical moment in the economic crisis in Greece. No one should be under any illusions. The situation risks going from bad to worse. There is no easy way out, but even at the 11th hour, we urge the Eurozone leaders and Greece to find a sustainable solution.
British Finance Minister George Osborne speaking during a session of Parliament today after Greece voted no in its national referendum yesterday, thereby denying austerity measures for international creditors in exchange for a bailout of the bankrupt economy in Greece. Osborne spoke very candidly, telling members of the House of Commons that if the Eurozone and Greece don't come to an understanding soon, the financial situation there will continue to deteriorate rapidly. For a more in-depth look, let's call on Peter Schiff, the CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital. Pete, thanks very much for your time here tonight on Newsmax Prime.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
The big question for all of us, what are the implications of the meltdown in Greece for the global economy?
Well, first of all, there's no way to avoid austerity. Even if the Greeks want to vote against it by voting no, they're not saying no to austerity. They're just saying no to European-imposed austerity, because the kind that they're going to have to impose on themselves is going to be even worse. If they end up being kicked out of the Eurozone and they have to go back to the drachma, the collapse in the value of the drachma and the massive inflation that they're going to be enduring is actually going to be much more austere than had they simply agreed to the types of cuts in government spending that the Europeans wanted. But as far as what it means to the global economy, I think, if anything, it should be a lesson. This is what happens when politicians promise more than their taxpayers can pay. Politicians on both sides of the Atlantic are guilty of this. They pander to the voters. They make all sorts of promises. And when the bills come due, it's a crisis. And they're going to come due in more countries than Greece. In fact, they're going to come due in America. And unfortunately, there's a lot more bills that we can't pay.
And that leads directly to the next question. What are the implications for our American economy?
Well, the only thing that really separates the U.S. from Greece is that Greek creditors have figured out that Greece is broke, and America's creditors are still delusional. They still think that we're good for our debts. And the only reason that that delusion is possible is because interest rates are still at zero. But were interest rates ever allowed to rise, it would become obvious that we can't pay our bills, and we would have a crisis similar to what Greece is looking at now.
And Peter, here at home, is it inevitable that one day those interest rates must rise?
Well, the only way we can keep them down is to keep printing money. And of course, by doing that, we eventually will collapse the value of our currency, much like I believe if the Greeks return to the drachma, there's going to be massive inflation. Well, I think if we stick with the dollar, but the Fed keeps printing them, if we end up unleashing QE4, which I think we're going to do, then foreign confidence will leave the dollar, and I think the dollar will collapse, and then we're going to live through a significant period of austerity ourselves as our standard of living plunges along with the exchange rate of the dollar.
Peter, you mentioned QE4. There's a danger we get into this shorthand and slang. Quantitative easing is what it means. Now, quantitative easing, can you give that to us in everyday language, what the reality of that is?
Well, it's simply when your central bank monetizes debt, government debt, by creating money out of thin air and spending it into circulation. I mean, that's the fate that I think awaits Greece if they return to the drachma. The Greeks don't want to accept cuts to their pensions, but if they end up getting their pensions in drachma instead of euros, those pension payments will be worth a lot less. The same thing, I think, happens to Americans. We're not going to change currencies, but I think the only way the U.S. government can make good on its obligations is to print the money. And when they do that, the money's not going to have very much value when the Social Security recipients or the bondholders ultimately get paid.
About a minute and a half left, Peter, which leads to the question we know through history in Germany's Weimar Republic, you had a situation where a wheelbarrow of Deutschmarks was necessary to buy a loaf of bread. Is Greece on that track? And if we fail to learn our lesson, are we on that type of track that we saw in the Weimar Republic?
Yeah, well, they were the Reichsmarks back then. Now the Deutschmark has been a lot stronger. But look, if Greece goes back to the drachma, they very well may end up having to cart them around in wheelbarrows. And the same thing could happen with the U.S. If we stay on the path that we're on, yeah, one day a wallet might not be big enough for your dollars. You may, in fact, need wheelbarrows to take them to the grocery store.
Or in this day and age, with the plastic type of currency we use today, is that essentially what bankers and others are relying on? We have about 30 seconds left.
Well, yes, certainly governments create money out of thin air more than they actually crank it off of a printing press. So most of the money exists in cyberspace. But as we increase the supply of that money, the value of that money plunges. And that's where you get into a hyperinflationary scenario, which is a worst case scenario, but it is a real threat both in Greece and the United States.
And it's a lesson hopefully we can learn before it's too late right here. Peter Schiff, CEO of Euro Pacific Capital, we thank you so much for your time. And Newsmax Prime will be back right after this.